On the evening of October 7th, 1871, a railroad freight agent named James Coburn was working late in a waterfront office on the south side of Chicago, finishing a cargo manifest he had been unable to complete during the day. At approximately 9 o'clock, he stepped outside for air and noticed an orange glow to the southwest, in the direction of the DeKoven Street neighborhood. He noted the time and the direction in his freight ledger, a habit of professional record-keeping he had maintained for 14 years, then went back inside. By midnight the glow had consumed the horizon. By the following morning 17,000 buildings were gone. The official history of the Great Chicago Fire begins with a cow and a lantern in Mrs. O'Leary's barn. That story appeared in a newspaper within 48 hours of the fire and has remained the standard account for 150 years, despite the fact that the journalist who first printed it, Michael Ahern of the Chicago Republican, admitted in 1893 that he had fabricated it. The Chicago City Council formally exonerated Catherine O'Leary in 1997. The barn origin story is still what most Americans believe. What James Coburn's freight ledger showed, and what 3 other independent eyewitness accounts from that evening corroborate, each placing the fire's origin point at least 2 blocks from the O'Leary property, is that the fire appears to have started at multiple points, almost simultaneously. An insurance investigator named Franklin Loomis, retained by the Chicago Mutual Insurance Company in the weeks after the fire, produced a 44-page report in November 1871 that concluded the fire had shown characteristics inconsistent with a single object on accidental ignition. Loomis identified at least 3 separate initial burn sites whose timing, based on the eyewitness accounts he collected, was too close together to be explained by wind-carried ember spread from a single source in the time available. His report recommended further investigation. Chicago Mutual's board reviewed the report. They settled their claims, dissolved the investigative file, and went out of business within 18 months, one of more than 200 insurance companies that failed in the fire's aftermath. The Loomis report has not been found in any archive. Its existence is known from a reference in a letter written by a Chicago Mutual board member to a business associate in St. Louis in December 1871. That letter is held in a private family collection. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. Now back to James Coburn's freight ledger, and to why what happened in Chicago in October 1871 was the first event in a pattern that would play out with remarkable consistency across the next 35 years of American financial history. To understand what was at stake in Chicago in 1871, we have to go back not to the night of the fire, but to the 18 months that preceded it, to a specific set of negotiations that the standard histories of Chicago's Gilded Age development have consistently placed in footnotes rather than in the main narrative. By 1870, Chicago was the fastest-growing city in the world. Its position as the terminal point of the railroad network connecting the eastern seaboard to the agricultural Midwest had made it the clearinghouse for a substantial portion of American commerce: grain, timber, livestock, manufactured goods. The city's banks held corresponding deposits. Its local financial institutions built by Chicago merchants and industrialists over the previous 2 decades, controlled credit allocation across an enormous economic region. In 1869 and 1870, representatives of the Eastern Banking Syndicate that would become, within the decade, the organizational precursor to the Morgan Financial Network, approached the leadership of Chicago's major financial institutions about terms of integration into a nationally coordinated banking framework. The terms as described in the surviving correspondence of at least 2 Chicago bank presidents required the surrender of local credit allocation authority to a centralized clearinghouse mechanism controlled from New York. The major Chicago institutions declined. Their reasoning, stated explicitly in the correspondence, was that local credit allocation, the ability of Chicago bankers to make lending decisions based on their own knowledge of Chicago enterprises and Chicago economic conditions, was the foundation of their competitive advantage and their service to the city's commercial community. They would not surrender it. 18 months later, the city's financial district was ash. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed the headquarters and records of every major independent Chicago bank. It destroyed the Cook County Courthouse and its contents, deeds, contracts, incorporation records, land titles going back to the city's founding. It destroyed the offices of the Chicago Board of Trade. It destroyed, in practical terms, the physical infrastructure of an independent financial ecosystem that had taken 20 years to build. The rebuilding that followed was financed through Eastern Credit at terms that the destroyed institutions would not have offered. Within a decade, the financial architecture of Chicago looked substantially different from what it had been in October 1871, and the institutions that had refused integration in 1869 and 1870 no longer existed in any form capable of refusing anything. That is one city, in 1 year. Boston, Massachusetts, November 1872, 13 months after Chicago, the Great Boston Fire destroyed 65 acres of the city's commercial district, the banking and insurance quarter, the warehouse district, the exchange buildings. The fire killed 13 people and caused an estimated $73 million in damage, equivalent to more than $7 billion today. The official cause was a spark from a building on Summer Street. An investigation by the Boston Board of Fire Underwriters produced a report noting that the fire had spread with unusual speed through buildings that had been constructed with what the report described as a new type of mansard roof covering that had been rapidly adopted across the district in the preceding years, a covering that burned far more readily than the materials it replaced. Who had promoted the adoption of the new roof covering? Who had supplied it to the district's building owners? The Fire Underwriters Report does not pursue this question. It notes the material's role in the fire's propagation and moves on to recommendations for updated building codes. Boston in 1872 had been the site of a specific and documented financial conflict. The New England banking community centered in Boston had in 1871 formally rejected a proposed national clearinghouse arrangement that would have subordinated Boston's independent note-issuing capacity to centralized federal oversight coordinated through New York institutions. The rejection was made on constitutional and commercial grounds by the Massachusetts Bankers Association in a resolution filed with the state legislature. That resolution was passed in the spring of 1871. The fire came in November of 1872, Portland, Oregon, June 1873. The Great Portland Fire destroyed 20 blocks of the city's core, including its entire commercial banking district. The cause was listed as an explosion in a furniture store. Portland had rejected, through its city council and its chamber of commerce, a proposed railroad bond arrangement in 1872 that would have transferred financial control of the city's main transport connection and the tariff income that came with it to Eastern interests. The rejection was formal and public. The fire came 8 months later, Seattle, Washington. June 1889, the Great Seattle Fire burned 25 blocks of the downtown core, including the city's major financial institutions. Seattle had been in active negotiation through 1888 over the terms under which its port facilities, the primary revenue-generating asset of the city's economy, would be developed. The local business community had rejected 2 successive proposals from Eastern Capital that would have placed port development and management authority outside local control. The fire came in June 1889, 7 months after the second rejection. Minneapolis, Minnesota, October 1893. Not a fire, but worth noting in the same sequence. Minneapolis had spent the previous 3 years developing an independent grain futures exchange that threatened to break the pricing monopoly held by the Chicago Board of Trade, which was itself by this point substantially reorganized under Eastern Capital following the 1871 fire. The Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce was informed in September 1893 that its exchange clearing arrangements would not be recognized by the National Clearing Network unless it agreed to operate under Chicago Board of Trade Authority. The Chamber refused. Within 2 months, the Panic of 1893 had collapsed the credit market across the Midwest, forcing the closure of 156 Minneapolis business concerns that had been solvent 6 months earlier. No fire was needed in Minneapolis. The same result was achieved through the credit system directly. The fire was the blunt instrument. The credit mechanism was the precise one. Minneapolis shows that the institutions using both understood the difference. Jacksonville, Florida, May 1901. The Great Jacksonville Fire destroyed 146 blocks, 2,368 buildings, and left 10,000 people homeless. It remains the largest urban fire in the history of the American South. Jacksonville had been, in the years immediately preceding the fire, the primary financial center of Florida and the banking hub for a significant portion of the state's agricultural economy. An Eastern banking syndicate had been attempting since 1898 to establish a controlling presence in Jacksonville's financial market and had been consistently blocked by the city's existing institutions. The fire of May 1901 destroyed those institutions. The rebuilding was financed from outside. San Francisco, California, April 1906. The earthquake and the fire. The official cause is geological. The San Andreas Fault, magnitude 7. 9. Undeniable and thoroughly documented. But the fire that followed the earthquake and the specific decisions made during those fires have a record that is not geological. San Francisco in 1905 had been the site of one of the most publicly contentious banking conflicts in American history. The city's financial community, led by the Crocker National Bank and the Savings Union, had been engaged in a sustained public dispute with the Clearing House Association over the terms by which Eastern banking capital would enter the California market. The dispute involved credit allocation authority, interest rate setting, and the question of whether California's gold reserves, held in San Francisco vaults, would remain under local institutional control or be placed under a national clearing mechanism. The dispute was unresolved in April 1906. After the earthquake, fire swept through the city. The fire chief, Dennis Sullivan, had been mortally wounded in the earthquake itself and died without being able to coordinate the fire response. In his absence, the decision to use dynamite to create fire breaks, a decision made by the Army under Brigadier General Frederick Funston, acting without civilian authority in a city that still had a functioning mayoral government, created fire breaks that the subsequent fire investigation concluded may have actually accelerated the fire's spread in several critical locations by opening drafts and destabilizing adjacent structures. General Funston was not an engineer. He was not a fire specialist. He acted on his own authority in the first hours after the earthquake, before any civilian coordination was established, and his decisions about where to blow buildings shaped which parts of San Francisco burned and which did not. The Crocker National Bank's records did not survive. The Savings Union's records did not survive. The gold reserve vaults were intact. Fire does not melt bank vaults, but the institutions around them were gone. The financial reconstruction of San Francisco in the years that followed produced a banking landscape that was substantially integrated into the Eastern clearing system that the city's pre-fire institutions had resisted. This is not a theory. The refusal records are in City Council minutes and Banking Association correspondence. The fire timelines are in insurance investigation reports. The post-fire financial restructuring is documented in the Banking Incorporation records of the years that followed in each city. What connects them is not a hidden document. It is the sequence refusal, then fire, then reconstruction on different terms, repeating across 5 cities in 35 years. The major financial institutions that oversaw the post-fire reconstruction of Chicago, Boston, Portland, Seattle, Jacksonville, and San Francisco have never adequately addressed several specific questions arising from this sequence. They have never addressed why the Franklin Loomis report identifying multiple simultaneous ignition points in the Chicago fire was dissolved along with its commissioning company, rather than being submitted to the city's own fire investigation. They have never addressed why the building material that accelerated the Boston fires spread through the financial district had been so rapidly and widely adopted in the years immediately preceding the fire, or who stood to benefit from a reconstruction cycle that replaced 65 acres of established commercial buildings with new structures built on newly cleared land under new ownership arrangements. They have never addressed why General Funston's unauthorized dynamiting decisions in San Francisco, decisions made in the critical first hours, before civilian authority was re-established, have received no formal military or civilian review in the 120 years since they were made. Why does the standard financial history of post-Gilded Age America describe the consolidation of American banking from dozens of regional centers into a New York coordinated national system as a natural and inevitable process of economic maturation, without examining the specific role played by the physical destruction, in each case by fire, of the independent institutions that had formally refused to participate in that consolidation? Why would 5 major American cities in the span of 35 years each suffer a catastrophic fire that destroyed its primary financial district within months or years of a documented formal rejection of Eastern banking integration terms? Why does the National Archives hold insurance investigation reports for the Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco fires that are available to researchers, but not the recommendation pages, which in each case are listed as removed prior to accessioning? The honest answer is that the available record cannot prove deliberate arson in any individual case. What it can show, and what it does show when the refusal correspondence, the fire timelines, and the post-fire financial records are placed in sequence, is a pattern so consistent and so economically coherent that the standard explanation, which is coincidence, requires more faith than the alternative. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in December 1913. It established, for the first time, a nationally coordinated banking framework with centralized credit authority. Every city that had refused integration in the preceding decades was, by 1913, either gone in its financial form or sufficiently restructured that its resistance was historical rather than present. The independent banking culture of Chicago's 1870 had been replaced. Boston's independent note-issuing capacity had been absorbed. San Francisco's gold reserve institutions had been integrated. The consolidation that had been refused repeatedly by formal institutional decision was complete. The official history tells us the Federal Reserve was the rational culmination of a generation of banking reform driven by the lessons of financial panics and the need for systemic stability. What the refusal correspondence, the fire records, the insurance investigation reports, and the post-fire incorporation documents together tell us is that the consolidation was not achieved by persuasion alone, and that the cities which declined to be persuaded did not remain in a position to decline for very long. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History doesn't disappear when it's buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week I'm going directly to Jekyll Island, November 1910, 6 men travelling under false names, and the first draft of the Federal Reserve Act, written in secret on a private hunting reserve owned by J.P. Morgan. A participant named Frank Vanderlip wrote about the meeting 30 years later, in his own words, describing exactly what was concealed and why. That account has been in print since 1935. Almost no one has read it. You won't want to miss it.